All right. Hello, everybody. I'm John Mailhot from Imagine Communications. This is my colleague, Gareth Wills. And today we're going to cover the rusty topic about the cloud and ground and cloud, or ground or cloud, or how would you ever make such a decision? So hang on. You know, there's this joke about the cloud, right? That what is the cloud? It's just someone else's computer. And of course, it's funny because it's true. So if you think about the economics of the cloud, it's based on some idea that, you know, someone else can buy a computer and own it and rent it to you cheaper than you buying it and renting it and owning it yourself. And is that true? I don't know. I look at our customers, they're pretty good at buying computers. If you walk through a broadcast control room, there's racks and racks of computers. So, you know, it's not strictly obvious. But anyway, for this discussion, what is the cloud, right? Because we think of you say cloud and people immediately jump and they say, oh, the cloud is AWS, or, oh, the cloud is, what's the one? OCI, Oracle, right?
Yeah.
But really the cloud, when you rent it, you're buying, by the minute, the hour, the day. You pick storage as well, you rent. The networking, you rent. You have to pay extra for basically anything. But you can also buy some cool stuff. You can buy a Kubernetes cluster that's all stood up. You can buy load balancing. Do you have to buy Lambdas, or are they free?
It depends on how many times you run them.
Oh, they're free until you need them.
Free until they aren't.
Yep. And then, of course, as software application providers, we like to wrench at that too. And everything's billed and metered, and that's what people usually call the cloud, is being able to rent all this stuff in some flexible way. And there are multiple cloud providers, and they have different rate cards, but they all kind of work in a similar way, which is to maximize the amount of money they can siphon out of your pocket before you scream. I'm sorry if I've offended anyone from any of the cloud providers in that statement. But equally, there's on-prem, right? What do you mean by on-prem? Well, if you're having a which one to do discussion, you could say, well, for one application, okay, maybe I have to buy some incremental computers. Maybe I have to buy some incremental storage. Maybe I have to buy another switch or something to hook it all up. So, on-prem, those kind of things you can fill out on a spreadsheet, and you can say, well, another computer is going to cost this, and a couple of network cables, a switch port, you could add those up. But there's also these intangible expenses about, what's the fair share of increment of the overhead cost of your building? What's the working value of cost of capital? Go ask your CFO what's the incremental cost of capital of buying something today. They'll have a very fascinating answer to it, but it's going to be a long answer. And then, of course, there's all kinds of risk, too. If you have to, you buy a bunch of stuff, and then 6 months later the project is canceled, what do you do with that stuff? But you have a stranded asset risk. All to say, if you want to compare the cost of doing something on-prem and the cost of doing something in the cloud, both of those costs are complicated answers. They're not just, oh, this one's $50. I mean, you have to look at really exactly what are you doing and how are you doing it. And there's a bunch of intangibles too. So there's things like, if it's in my data center, I know that my guys can go fix it. Do you? I mean, everybody's everybody believes that their own team is so good that they're going to be able to run down the stairs with the magic screwdriver and fix something. And it's true, but it's also, how relevant is that? I mean, it's a variety of challenges with that whole idea, right? But, what if the whole, Amazon East goes down? Like, where am I in line? And the answer is, you're in line with a lot of other people. But on the other hand, it's not your fault.
And you don't have to fix it.
And you don't have to fix it, but you do have to explain it. Yeah. So, and does that even really happen, right? But equally, you could have the same question about your own building. What if your own building, has a flood or has a fire or something? I mean, there's a lot of things that can make your building inaccessible for working purposes. And how do you factor that risk into a calculation, right? So there's all these kind of intangible factors that are actually also important, because ultimately when you're building a television facility or you're putting out television programming, you're managing risk. You're not just managing expense. Managing expenses is important, but managing risk is also important. So you have to, evaluate what is the risk. And then there's some things that are not negotiable, like, the EAS receiver has to be in the market because that's where the signals it picks up are, stuff like that. So you always have to look at the whole picture, not just the spreadsheet of costs. But all that said, you do want to start to balance costs. So you start to talk about utilization. So what's utilization, Gareth?
So utilization is around how much you're going to be using a resource. So for example, if I've got a remote edit suite, I might be using that 6 hours a day, might be using that at about 20% utilization. But the intangible about having a data center an edit suite and using it in the cloud or an on-prem is the intangible such that if I put it in the cloud, maybe some other part of my organization can leverage that and bring up that utilization value. 24/7 playout is another good example. So that's 100% utilization. So might make sense to put that on-prem, but the intangible there is you still need redundancy strategy. So if your building goes down, catches fire, or there's a flood, you still need to be able to continue operation.
Right. You need, and that intangible is not that intangible, right? We've had actual customers that have had, facilities with water in the basement and stuff. It really happens that bad things can happen.
The next example is backing up an on-prem playout channels. In other words, you might want to run it 10 hours a week. That's around 6% utilization. It might be for dev testing. It might be for training. It might be for other testing. But you need to consider all of the other devices around the edges in order to make that a fully operational facility, such as things like EAS and other things that are tied to your local facility.
Right.
Then there's example around linked and regional splits. So, for example, if I've got a regional channel, that's about 12% utilization, but we'd still run that as a 24/7, 100% utilization on-prem. But how can we make it more efficient by spinning up these regional lists in the cloud? And then the other intangible is then how do we link the playlist from on-prem into the cloud such that when I spin up that resource that it dynamically connects to the to the ground and pulls the metadata and the playlist information.
Right. But do broadcasters actually do these regional splits?
Yes, they do a lot of regional splits.
It's an easy question, right? So you have utilization. So that means there must be a balance point, right? There must be some point at which it makes sense or doesn't make sense. Balancing the intangibles is another question. But
yeah. So these were prices that we did a couple of months ago, so they may have changed in the last month or even in the last 24 hours. But on-prem,
you think they went up or down?
Not too sure. If you're watching this on replay, you can tell us later. So on-prem, you obviously need to buy an HP server, internal storage, maybe a 25 gig Ethernet adapter. Roughly, a COT server is going to cost you about $16,700 across 3 years. If we look at the cloud, we've done a big instance size, so it's around about $2 an hour, where it works out roughly about $16,000 a year.
Boy, $2 an hour sounds really inexpensive, right? That's like less than you can't even get a cup of coffee for $2.
But when you're running it 24/7,
yeah, but suddenly that $16,000 a year that's a lot of cups of coffee.
Yeah, so per year it's around about $17,750 to run the same instance in the cloud versus on-prem. So the cost parity is around 30% utilization. And what this is really telling us is when you look at it, if you've got devices on-prem that are sitting idle for 70% of the time, then it might make sense to move that into the cloud. And if you've got use cases where you're going to use things less than 30% capacity, then it might make sense to also move those to the cloud.
Yep. But you do have to remember the intangibles too.
Yeah.
Now on-prem, what's utilization on-prem? Because if you own it and you're not using it, do you lose money? Like, how's that work?
Yeah, so traditionally TV broadcasters are designed for worst case load, right? So for example, if we're doing, back to our regional split example, if we're doing 3 regional splits, those chains and those transmission paths are still running 365, 24/7, 365. So if we add a 4th regional split, we also need to add another device to run that channel, and that also runs, using the same utilization.
Mm-hmm. Yep. But, that utilization, I mean, there's also availability, right? How do I do this, A-B playout chains? I mean, every facility I go into, there's an A side and a B side, and there's backup generators and all this stuff. You're still stuck with that if you do anything on-prem, right?
Correct. So traditionally TV broadcast facilities are designed for high availability, so they like to mirror everything, have an A side and a B side, as well as mirrored storage, mirrored networking. And generally, if you look at it, this is not necessarily sustainable from both financial point of view and also a carbon footprint point of view. So the secret is to be able to balance, when you use cloud at the right time, and when you use on-prem resources at the right time as well.
Right. But I look around and there's all these products that run in the cloud, but they don't have a prem version. And there's these other things that work on prem, but they don't have a cloud version. So I have to have like 2 completely different ones of everything.
No, the secret is, and you want to balance it. So you want to get the best of both worlds, right? So you want to be able to share resources across both the on-prem facilities that you own and also cloud facilities. So the idea is not looking at your facilities as fixed workloads that this ingest server does this on a Monday and does the same thing all week. You want to be able to say, well, this ingest server is going to be ingest when I need it, and it's going to be play out when I need more play out resource. So it's about getting dynamically scalable workloads within your facility. So things like scheduled events, breaking news, or special programming, what you can spin up and scale up when you need it. And you can burst capacity in the cloud when it's cost effective to do so. So for example, those regional splits, if you're only using them, 12% of the time or 12% utilization, then it might make sense to move those play out devices into the cloud.
Right. But suppose on-prem you could deploy things. So you could do regional splits in the evening, but you could use those same servers for ingest or edit or whatever during the day. Do people do that?
Yeah. So the trick is orchestration, is to be able to say, is to build play out devices or build devices within your facility quickly, and to be able to dynamically associate them with lists and be flexible with redundancy. So for example, if I've got a sports event, let's say the Super Bowl, I might want to have 3 backup devices running that event. But overnight, I only want to have one device running it. So what that allows you to do is be really scalable with your resource. It also helps you with your sustainability story, because when you're not using those resources, you're not consuming electricity, you're not consuming, air conditioning, and so you can get more. It helps with your sustainability story.
Right, but operationally, isn't this hard?
The trick is to have a single operational control plane. So whether I'm running on-prem or in the cloud, from an operational perspective, I want it to look and feel the same. So if I'm an operator and I'm running one of those regional splits, it should look the same, whether it's on-prem or whether it's in the cloud. And so the trick is just to have everything on a single control plane.
Okay. So, we talk a lot about ground or cloud, making this ground or cloud decision. But, suppose it's DR. Like, DR seems like the most obvious cloudable thing, right?
Yeah, so look at DR as an example. So I have my on-prem facility that's running at 100% utilization, but my B side, i.e. what I designed as a high availability system, may not necessarily be needed to be run 365, 24/7. So think about cloud DR as the ability to be able to have resources available to run. Let's say they're provisioned but not idle. So running, they're idle provisions, but actually at idle. And remember the complexity about synchronizing them, right? So you need a device to be able to say, if this device is idle, I want it to be able to have my playlist ready to go in case I can quickly switch to that DR. So
Yep.
you've also got to be.
So that means all the content has to be pushed, the list has to be available. You probably want to make sure you have continuity on the return path, because you'd really like to know it's going to work before you just click go.
And test it frequently. So making sure that the content's there, the playlists are there, everything's 100% synced. So even if, let's say you want to scale when needed, right? So you might have a lifeboat channel with evergreen content playing, for example. And, if something happens and depending on the length of the outage, then I can scale up as needed. So I can have something ready to go right then, but then from an orchestration perspective, we can actually add more and more resources as we identify the sort of the depth of the challenge that we're facing from a DR perspective.
Yep. And this testing thing is important. When I go visit facilities, one of the questions I ask is, whoa, what's your DR strategy? And everyone tells you their elaborate plan. And I say, how often do you run in that plan? And so the answer varies. Like some people say, oh, we tried it once. and other people say we run every Tuesday night. We run that way, which is, by the way, the better answer, right? This idea that you have to actually exercise your DR and it has to really work with real content and the ads have to run, it has to be real, is important. And that's one of the great things about the cloud is that cloud-based DR, you can run it like it's real and use it like it's real, and actually it has to work, right? So are there other capacity examples?
So another example is the Olympics. So you look at it over a year sort of time horizon. You say, I'm going to run it for, let's say, 3 weeks. So therefore it's probably around
it's about 6 weeks in the summer, but yeah.
6 weeks in summer. Probably around about 5% utilization when you look at it over a year. So being able to burst capacity and put those devices into the cloud means that you don't have any shipping. You don't have to worry about hardware. You don't have to worry about where that hardware is built. You can reduce your racking costs. You can reduce your networking. And really you can leverage that pay-per-view scalability and those services you mentioned around, EKS and databases and just spin up systems, really quickly for these short-term special events.
Right. And then like these intangible costs we talk about, one of the intangibles around things like the Olympics or other major events is staff cost, especially if it's staff cost on site. So if the gear's on site, you kind of think, oh, well, the editors ought to be on site and the operator, everybody ought to be on site. Once the gear's in the cloud, it's really kind of less critical where those people are. And you can do the whole staffing thing a little bit remotely too.
It helps with remote collaboration. So you can do some follow the sun operations. So we can be doing highlight packages overnight while the team on site at the Olympics are sleeping, for example. The other thing that's really good about the cloud in these scenarios, if you want to run OTT channels or distribution straight to the internet, then there's the CDN, so you just hand off those feeds directly within that cloud environment. So it's great for OTT delivery, and you don't have to bring those feeds down to the ground and have the egress costs.
Yep. And that's really a huge thing, right? Because if you're going to distribute through the cloud, having the signal already in the cloud is kind of, you save a buck in there somehow.
And more distribution in terms of receiving feeds is also being done, internally within the cloud as well. So you don't have to worry about satellite infrastructure pulling down live feeds.
Yep. Now, these regional splits, is that the future of television?
Yeah, so I had a quote from someone I was talking about with the regional splits, and they said that it costs more for someone to fill freebies across a 24-hour channel in terms of a regional channel than they actually make selling spots. So what we need to do is be really conscious about spinning up these resources. So for example, if you want to run 3 regional channels that are in prime time, you should be able to automatically attach those to the primary playlist, do your regional splits when it's cost effective to do so. And then have those spin down once in non-peak times. So what this really does is increase efficiency in terms of regional. So where it was inefficient to run a regional, or so you can add those regions, and when you don't need those regions, you can scale back.
Yep. So, in the end, none of this is surprising, right? We all go through in our own life the concept, do I lease a car? Do I buy a car? Or do I just take Uber everywhere? And, there's intangible and tangible, right? Factors for that. Most people would be better off if they just took Uber everywhere, but very few people do that. Is the same true with the cloud?
They're really, it's just all about choices, right? So the cloud wins when you've got low utilization tasks, when you want to do pay-as-you-go flexibility, when you want to dynamically scale, but on-prem wins when you've got lots of fixed jobs. When you're running something 24/7, it gives you long-term predictability. You can also control your own destiny with control, security, and things like EAS. And you can also leverage your existing investments. So the key is really sort of how you seamlessly orchestrate and automate across both cloud and on-prem and have that consistent operational plane. And that's where you can really maximize both your utilization and your cost efficiency across both cloud and on-prem.
Okay. And that's our punchline. Thank you all.